Hello and welcome to Benyo Chats, my personal podcast. If you're curious about the world, this show is for you. What's the future of remote work? How best do we spark and develop innovation? On this episode, I speak to Matt Clancy. We discuss how Matt is thinking about innovation, the synthesis of work he's doing on what nurtures innovation, and the future of remote work. If you like the show, please like and subscribe as it helps others find the podcast. Enjoy. Hey everyone, I am super excited to chat with Matt Clancy. Matt is a Progress Fellow at Emergent Ventures. He teaches at Iowa State University and writes on Substack, a newsletter called New Things Under the Sun, which you should subscribe to if you're interested in anything innovation related. Matt has also synthesized many of the emerging studies on remote working. So Matt, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on. Really it's a pleasure to be here.
Great. There has been plenty of debate as to whether innovation has been stagnating and whether it might now be rejuvenating to some extent. And there's this observation and several studies that showing or suggesting that it's costing more R&D dollars to achieve similar progress across several domains, such as pharmaceutical drugs, crop yield, semiconductor productivity, and that seems to hold. But there are counter arguments around whether we are measuring the correct things. And I think Dietrich Vollrath has attributed apparent progress a lot to human capital factors. What's your reading of the arguments, and do you have a sense about where we stand and how obvious this observation might be or not?
Yeah, so this is like a huge topic, so there's kind of two waves of stagnations that people talk about. And there was like the big stagnation, which was kind of starting in the 70s or so. And, you know, total factor productivity is one way people try to measure technological progress of the entire society. It's roughly like a statistical way to pull out, I'd say like the extra oomph you get from the same number of inputs. And that grew at a rate of like 2.8% between, I think it's like in the 50 years around 1920 to 1970 maybe. And then it fell to like 1.6% since then. And so that's sort of the big one, because that compounds over time and it makes a big difference. But then there's been this sort of smaller mini stagnation since the 2000s, and the 1.6 fell again. And so I think where I stand is that I think that the significance of sort of the big stagnation is, I think, real, but I think it's a little bit overstated for some reasons. I think the significance of the sort of the littler stagnation since the 2000s is not really about technological progress slowing down. It's more about other things. So Dietrich Vollrath has this really great book, Fully Grown. And he really digs into the numbers of like the second stagnation, the little stagnation, and kind of shows that you can really account for this without having to go to, technology. It's kind of like that old quip about like, you don't mention God in your explanations. Was it like Descartes or something? And he's like, I have no need for that hypothesis. I think Vollrath sort of does the same thing with like this little stagnation. He's like, all right, if you look at declines in geographic mobility, the decline in the start and stop rate of firms entering, exiting, you can like account for most of this total factor productivity slowdown since the 2000s and a couple other things. And you don't really need to say anything like it's due to technology. And also a big one is the transition of consumers from purchasing easily like products that have that are manufactured and are really it's really easy to like make them better and make total factor productivity better for making like a TV. And consumers are just buying less of that stuff and buying more and more stuff like services, like healthcare and education and stuff, which is harder to advance. It's harder to improve the total factor productivity of those things. Like you think of like a daycare. My kids go to daycare and like they're cared for by like one person for every 4 kids if they're like babies. And like, you don't necessarily want to like have one person caring for like 60 kids or something like that, right? Like there's something about the person. So it's hard to improve the efficiency of labor in that second. Anyway, we're spending more money on that stuff because basically the other stuff is so cheap and we've gotten so good at making it, it can be the case that there was no slowdown in technological progress in like making TVs or making computers, but we kind of satisfied our demands for. We're like, well, these are great, and I'm going to use the money I saved instead of buying an even bigger TV. I'll buy only a little bit bigger TV and use the extra money on this other stuff. And that means more spending is allocated to the slower growing sectors of the economy. There may not have been a slowdown. It's just that we're spending more on the slower growing sections. And so it looks like a slowdown in TFP. That's a long-winded thing about the second one. But the first one, that's, I think you can't necessarily write it off using the same kind of techniques. And Noah Smith has this kind of interesting theory that it's all about the energy shocks in the 1970s, and that technology was on this trajectory up through, through most of the 20th century until the 1970s, that was premised on using more and more energy to do more and more cool stuff, like fly to the stars or, robots and all sorts of stuff. And in the 1970s, the oil shocks made oil really expensive. And I think that kind of, I think there's this, it's my working hypothesis, and I haven't like dug in it. This is the kind of thing where like it kind of qualitatively sounds like it could work, but I haven't dug into the numbers to see if it really can account for everything. But my sort of pet theory is that, similar to I think Noah Smith's, is that like oil shocks meant people felt like we can't count on there just being abundant energy, and instead of diverting resources towards R&D that's going to depend on there being abundant energy, we're going to divert R&D towards energy efficiency. And I think this created this big expectation. It's not like scientists were just as productive as ever at figuring stuff out, but the kinds of things they were figuring out weren't the things that people had been conditioned to start to expect through movies and visions and extrapolating from trends. And so instead of getting supersonic planes and space flight and stuff, we got energy efficient heaters or stuff that sort of sounds lame, or like there's
better
this quip that better insulation. But there's this quip that the speed of travel across the United States hasn't sped up at all, but like it's gotten a lot more energy efficient over that time,
and it's actually got safer.
It's got a lot safer.
Well, planes have got safer.
Right. And so there's these, it's like the future doesn't look like we thought it would because we were extrapolating and we sort of changed tracks. And so that's why I think that it's real, but also that it is a little bit exaggerated, because I think the progress is real, but, the world feels qualitatively different when you have like new kinds of products that you've never seen before doing with new capabilities, versus when you have your existing products being more efficient and safe. It just doesn't feel necessarily like things are advancing at the same rate because you're not being surprised and wow. But I don't know if that I wouldn't necessarily think the second kind of innovation is any less important. And so that's kind of my take, is that the energy shocks set us on a trajectory that was different. And so it doesn't look like we expected it to. And then on top of that, there's this period of there probably was a period of like inefficient research, or where R&D wasn't producing technologies as quickly as it had before, because they had to sort of retrain, rebuild up the knowledge set to do this kind of new type of R&D that was premised on different things than abundant energy. And that that meant that people weren't as productive until they sort of rebuilt the knowledge base to where it was for energy efficiency. So there's this famous paper by Darren Acemoglu about climate change and how we need to subsidize technological progress in addition to doing a carbon tax. And he sort of talks about how as R&D for fossil fuel-based transportation has continued all along. Internal combustion engines get better and better and better. And as they get better and better and better, it gets harder and harder to like switch to energy efficient stuff, because there's going to be like, if the technology is not at that level, then there's this big sort of step down in living standards as we transition to this other thing. And so he kind of is talking about how you need to subsidize that other technology field to sort of catch up to providing the same capabilities that we can get from the fossil fuel derived stuff. And there's a role for subsidies in addition to just carbon taxes to doing that. And I think it's kind of the same idea. Yeah. And then the last part is just that I think people have this bias towards things were better when I was younger.
Right.
So
yes.
that is just this continual, like, that's just sort of this omnipresent
nostalgia
thing in the background. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, that's raised a load of interesting thoughts, which we can discuss. So one is on, and in fact, we spoke earlier to Anton Howes about the difference we put on incremental innovation versus transformational. And I think you're saying incremental is kind of undervalued. The second is, I think what I would thought of as what some people might call the Bommel effect, that idea, like you said, on childcare, which would be the same for waste services, arguably the same in some big sectors like healthcare and education. Like you want teacher ratios and doctor ratios, you can't scale that. Can't scale that much further. And then a little bit, I think it'd be really interesting on that climate fossil fuel piece, because the data I've seen suggests that, for instance, the R&D part, looking at renewable energy worldwide, both public and private, has only been around the order of $15 billion, which is a real tiny drop in the ocean. We spent about probably 2 trillion order of magnitude on R&D last year, and much more on fossil fuel R&D, like you say, I think at least 10 times more, whereas renewable energy piece is only 15. I'm kind of interested, though, I guess, on two parts on the measurement things. How do you think, does this, I guess, account for these kind of more general purpose inventions or not? I'm really intrigued by, for instance, double-blind trial design. So these are kind of what you might call RCTs or whatever. And I'm interested in a couple of ways, because one is, in theory, we could have invented them a lot earlier. I think actually even in ancient times, a couple of empires had this, but it didn't stick. And then even famously, when it was kind of reinvented around the time of trying to eradicate scurvy with ships going, they kind of lost it a couple of times before it stuck. And then it started in medicine and now is in economics and all over. And I was wondering about how effective do you think that those general purpose things go into these measurements? And the second area, actually, why don't you start on that one?
Yeah. So about how you measure these general purpose technologies, that's one reason that people like things like these really big aggregate measures, like just real GDP per capita or total factor productivity, because the hope is that all that stuff spins out into rather than trying to figure out exactly what the benefit of, say, double-blind testing is, you're just like, well, eventually it ends in better knowledge, which lets us develop better pharmaceutical companies, and that gets reflected in their sales, and that gets reflected in real GDP per capita. And so that's kind of the argument for these really big aggregate ones, is that you can kind of you don't have to get into the nitty-gritty of thinking of all the different ways that any one invention could have positive effects. But then the downside is that it's so far removed, and also that there's lots of other things that can affect those measures than just the quality of knowledge. And so it's a real problem. And in terms of the benefits of RCTs or double-blind testing, I guess, I think that's a really interesting problem too. Or how would you measure the gains from that? I mean, I think you would look at, if I was you'd pick a domain for one, like say medicine, and you'd look at kind of the quality of, I don't know, the trajectory of improvement in diseases that use this method versus ones that don't. That might be one hypothetical way to do it.
Sure.
But in general, I think it's
arguably you don't have any modern medicine. So no pharmaceuticals would exist without this, because you wouldn't know whether they worked. Sort of.
Right.
So that is essentially all of medicine doesn't exist without this one general purpose. And then actually it spills over into many other things. It could have started in medicine, but obviously you have it in these other things. So yeah, intriguing. Do you think TFP actually accounts for that, or does it miss something?
I mean, TFP and real GDP per capita, they both all kind of, what the things they miss are things that are not captured in transactions, because ultimately they derive their value. So if if double-blind testing develops better medicines that then people are like willing to pay more for, or even if it has this indirect effect where they like live more and then they're able to produce more of economic value through their lives, that would sort of get caught, that would sort of be in there. But you know, the satisfaction they get from like being alive or from being able to see grandma for another 20 years, like that is just missed from these figures. And so, you know, it's a problem. What people sometimes say is like, well, if it's a problem, hopefully it's not a problem that changes its intensity over time, because then you can at least still, you can be like, well, then tack on an extra 50% in value, but since it's constant through time, we can still look at the trends we have. I don't know. I mean, you have to make, for any specific case, you can probably make arguments whether that's sensible or not. But I do think this idea that like double-blind testing can be lost, and it's an old, easy to understand idea, but how come people didn't do it? I think it like kind of emphasizes the value of like good measurement for just innovation. Like if you want to facilitate incremental innovation, like being able to detect a 3% improvement is like really important, because otherwise, if there's a lot of noise, people will just forget it, and then nothing gets, we don't build on anything, right? We just sort of get stuck trying new things, then abandoning them and trying different things instead of keeping the ones that work and then getting 3% better every year.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess you partially answered one of my follow-up thoughts would be on one aspect of that. So I'm quite intrigued by pain or pain control. So because actually it doesn't cost very much now for pain control. So morphine or even headaches, aspirin, costs very little. But if you ask people, the utility is quite high to not suffer from headaches, even though we don't pay very much for it in dollars. And then actually you can take it to an extreme where today, and arguably say for the last 50 to 70 years, you can now spend the last month of your life, if you've got some terminal illness, pain-free, more or less pain-free, because you could be on morphine or something like that. And if you were to ask people, and some people do, would you exchange half your fortune or even your entire fortune to now be able to die pain-free in the last month of your life? A lot of people are kind of saying yes. And your family around you, knowing that you can be pain-free, is incredibly valuable. And I can understand that's one single step up, because, you know, we're not going to end that. But I am interested because I'm not sure it is constant over time, although I have no idea how you'd imagine it, measure it. But it seems to me enormously valuable that now for quite a lot of humanity for the rest of time, more or less we can die pain-free. That's kind of an unbelievable amount of value, which is not captured in any of these measurements. Is that a kind of correct way of looking at it, or is there more complications about how we see value, or I guess progress in its most widest sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you're getting at is sort of the difference between consumer surplus, which is the gap between somebody's willingness to pay and what they actually pay, and then what they actually pay. And you know, in a perfectly competitive market, like the price something is charged is the marginal willingness to pay of the last person or whatever, you know. But there's all this other non-marginal people, like you know, who are deriving enormous benefits from it. And sometimes you hear, like, I haven't heard people talk about it in the sense of alleviation of pain, and I think that's a really good example. But it is something that people have wondered a lot about in terms of the quality of digital goods. Like, so the value of the internet basically is people don't spend very much. There are still costs associated with it that show up in GDP. You know, transactions that are conducted over the internet, advertising that is spent, that, you know, they spend more on ads if they think people are going to spend more on time, which is in some very indirect way a signal of the value people get from being online. But it's very indirect, and you know, there have been estimates that the value people derive from, say, Facebook is like, I think at the median value in surveys and auctions where they do these experiments where they're going to actually pay people to delete their Facebook account. And like, you know, the median willingness to pay is like over $1,000. Maybe that's the mean, but anyway, is really high. And obviously Facebook for most people is free. And I think that the ads per person that are spent on Facebook are way under $1,000 too. So, that's, people have looked into trying to say like, well, maybe this mismeasurement is why we seem to have this little stagnation since the 2000s. And the sense I get is that most people think that that doesn't really seem to work. And Robert Gordon, who wrote this famous Rise and Fall of American Growth book that sort of surveys the history of innovation and technological change in the United States going back to 1850. He also talks about these uncaptured gains. And I think he would argue something like, well, the gain from morphine is a lot bigger than the unmeasured gain we get from pain alleviation and morphine or whatever is much higher than the unmeasured gains we get from the internet. So he would argue that this makes the case stronger for a slowdown. He emphasizes things like, people used to wear clothes that were just really uncomfortable and scratchy. That was like their whole lives, and people didn't have air conditioning. They just had to live in the ambient temperature. And we don't, in the developed world, we don't think about these costs anymore. And those gains were not necessarily like the full value people were willing to get from those were not necessarily captured in the GDP, and ways of measuring total factor productivity were a lot shakier back then too. So he argues that, we're undercounting the gains in the past, if anything. So
okay, yeah, that makes sense. Maybe a question we will probably not quite ever fully answer, but I can see those arguments. Maybe taking one wider step, touching perhaps into philosophy. What do you think about other aspects of progress, which we might think about as progress, but what doesn't necessarily square into innovation? So I'm thinking about social or maybe moral progress, maybe most obviously seen for things like, say, women's rights or minority rights, or going back, in time even to slavery, where you get a consensus today that generally that's better and therefore quite valuable, particularly for those groups, say women's and minorities. And again, I guess this is something which generally doesn't go into GDP, although there probably is a GDP element by getting women into the workforce or TFP, but generally think there is some aspects of progress. And actually the arguments that some of those harder to ascertain parts of progress, I guess, gay marriage for people who want that now, which is on the increasing notes of a moment, they are seeing some progress and therefore some innovation. Would you put that within the scope of kind of progress or within that, or is it just too far outside what we can measure?
No, I certainly think that in some ways that's sort of the most important types of progress. This kind of progress is ultimately probably more important than a lot of material progress that's made. But it's definitely not captured in GDP, and that's a problem. One way that you can try to get around that is, to try to use, the measure of, people do try to do these indices of like inequality, for example, where they adjust for the utility people get maybe from different levels of income, where if you have declining marginal utility, then that means having a couple really rich people doesn't offset having loads of poor people. But still, that's still ultimately getting to sort of material measures. I think that these other kinds of progress, they don't follow necessarily a lot of the same dynamics that I study, like intellectual property rights or emerging from basic science or this or that. But I still think they're really important and sort of undervalued. And I have this sort of thought actually, like that we should have there's a little bit too much emphasis sometimes on just like the hard material innovation. Like, there's sometimes people underrate this stuff. Like they focus too much on, the material, like going forward, just like having cool, like new sci-fi type inventions and sort of that being the main thing we want. But like, we shouldn't neglect sort of what I call like this, the social technology, like, that stuff is in some ways like more important than for like people's lives. Like when you think about this like critique of like the little stagnation that people are spending more money on services instead of things, I feel like that's like a signal you don't necessarily want to ignore, that like people are like, all right, well, we've had thanks for making these TVs. These are great. And thanks for making all this other stuff. But I'll keep all that. But now I want to focus on these other parts of my life. And, improving kind of these non-material parts seems like something maybe, since that's where people are spending their money, that's telling us that that's really important. And one thing that's kind of interesting I've thought about is like sometimes these things aren't as unrelated as you think. Like think of like social cohesion or like marriage or something like that. And so like marriage has been, and dating and finding partners has been like really affected by online dating technology, basically, right? And so sometimes the material stuff does have significant impact on the quality of sort of these aspects of our life that are not like entirely mediated through economic exchange. Or like I've been a big believer in remote work, and one of the reasons is that it like lets people choose where they want to live and how they want to live their lives more based on things like their community and who they know, their social ties, rather than necessarily having to have that choice set constrained by this is where the jobs are that fit my skills.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so, like you say, GDP actually correlates quite well with a lot of these other things like happiness or peace, although not perfectly. Okay, right. So thinking maybe upstream about innovation. So Anton House has this idea that it's kind of the improving mindset that you need before kind of innovation sparks in individuals. I was wondering whether you had any thoughts about what might spark off innovation generally, and what are the factors that you think about? People talk about agglomeration effects. Do you have to be in cities? Now we've got remote work. Anton thinks, you've got to start with the person and then all of these other things. Probably not proven any particular way, but I'd be interested in where you think there might be a spark of innovation. Does it start with the person, in which case, policy should be maybe designed around that?
Yeah, so I really like Anton's emphasis on people changing their mindset and changing what they believe. So, Joseph Henrich has this book, The Secret of Our Success, which is sort of this long history of like cultural evolution in the human species and so on. And he talks about how through most of human history, cultures got more complicated, and essentially we would say innovation happened. It just happened at a really slow rate, but tools got more advanced and stuff. And that all happened without really an improving mindset. I think people just accidentally, no, maybe it did, I don't know. But for whatever reason, when people were like learning how to make tools or whatever, or like hunting practices, they imperfectly copied whoever somebody else was. And maybe they were a tinkerer looking to improve, or maybe it was just a mistake, or maybe it was serendipity. But by observing what worked, and sort of an evolutionary process allowed innovations happen, but it was super slow. And I think one of the big things that changed in the Industrial Revolution is that people got this idea that you can, I should preface this by saying, so like, go back before the Industrial Revolution, and if you're living in a world where, if you're living in that kind of world where people have a really poor causal understanding of how things work, it's like the best survival strategy is going to be to like be good at copying what works for other people in your society and not trying to improve it, because 9 times out of 10 when you try to improve it, you're going to make it worse. And Henrich's book has these really awesome examples of like preparing poisonous plants for consumption, and there are these like, it's extremely onerous. There's lots of things you have to do. It's very time consuming and very like lots of effort. And many of the steps don't seem to do anything. Like if you're the one who's, if you're just trying to reason about it, like you can't see what the impact of boiling it for 24 hours is, for example. But that stuff is really working. It's like leaching the poison out, and it's leaching it out in a way that you won't be able to detect just by taste or getting sick in 24 hours. But it would, if you skipped these steps, you'd pay the prices by dying 20 years earlier or something like that. So in that kind of world where there's all these sort of opaque things going on in the background of how your technology works, the best thing to do is going to be to just copy, and don't try to be smarter than everybody else and figure it out. Because if you try to take shortcuts, there's a reason things are the way they are. They were selected that way through like being the fittest, and you're going to get it wrong. But then like by the Industrial Revolution, we had technology had changed enough that there was sort of scope for just like tinkering and figuring things out. I think some of this is like just the sort of a new menu of technologies to tinker with that hadn't been optimized over millennia. So there really were some free lunches around. And then at the same time, you had this growing scientific knowledge of how the world works that made also proactively going out there and trying to figure out better ways to do things like a more reasonable activity. And it's been, I think, there's been this switch in the last 300 years where now actively trying to think of better ways to do things is suddenly something that sort of makes sense, suddenly in like a very long run thing for our species. But I think we still have like this baggage from like our deep evolutionary past of like, that's not something we normally think of doing. We think like we're sort of biased towards the status quo, because for millennia, the status quo, trying to deviate from the status quo was usually a bad idea. And so, what's interesting is I think like in the modern developed world, you can get the status quo can become in some places that you just try to do new things. Like if you live in Silicon Valley, or if you live in an era where there's lots of people doing new and exciting things, that becomes the thing that you copy for other people. And you say like, so we sort of hijack these old processes where it's like, previously I would copy, the canoe making techniques of the guy who lived the longest and seemed to have just had the most prestige in the community, and he built really good canoes and he was around because he made them, and whatever. But now you like copy Elon Musk or something, right? So that gets that sort of improving mentality. So yeah, I think that's like I think that we're like in better shape than ever in terms of creating improving mindsets, but we fight this really big battle because like our bias is always going to be towards just doing what everybody else is doing, not taking new risks. And so we've entered like and so we there's something fragile about it, where if innovation did stop, it would kind of then it could sort of stop. It could get locked in at this frozen level because you suddenly don't have people getting the idea to try to do new things right now. And right now we're in this really lucky equilibrium where there's enough people trying to invent new things that is something that is seen as a normal thing to do. And you don't have to rely only on weirdos and outcasts doing it, I guess.
Great. Okay. I'm going to call that the evolutionary biology idea of innovation and status quo, which I haven't heard before, but I could see, social cohesion during the ice age. You've got to do what everyone does, otherwise you're not going to survive. And therefore we'll do that. And now if you're in South San Francisco and you're not working on a startup, you're a little bit weird because surely that's what everyone else is doing. And so you might be part of that.
Exactly. But yeah, so Henrik's book has these awesome examples of explorers going to these places where indigenous people live successfully for millennia. And it's like this natural experiment where these explorers, they get stranded and they have to figure out how are we going to survive there. And they can't, they usually die. And it's because pre-1800s or whatever, the natural world is not the kind of thing that the human brain can just figure out in one go. It takes generations of standing on people's shoulders to survive.
You dropped me in the Indonesian jungle right now. You probably never seeing or hearing from me ever again.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So maybe moving downstream one piece then. So say you are in charge of a medium large firm, say maybe 5,000 staff, and maybe 500 or 500 to 1,000. So maybe 10% or 20% of your budget is on R&D. So you're working on innovation. How are you, I guess this is called corporate lab question. How do you think they should be thinking about organizing their innovation or not? I'm particularly interested in, do you think small teams or large teams? And do you think the sector or the problem makes a difference? So whether you're eking out more, say, incremental process improvements versus perhaps a transformational, more moonshot idea does that vary, or should we always be thinking about a small team or a large team? And then, I'm going to go on and ask you about agglomeration effects with that or not,
Sure.
where you should cite it, and also size. But let's start with kind of small team or large team, or anything you should think about organizational R&D effectiveness, now that we've decided that we are going to work on this innovation problem.
Right. So now we've generated a pool of people who have improving mindsets, and we're going to figure out how to organize them best.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, I'd preface this by saying there's like a huge literature of people who this is like their life work to think about these problems. And so I'll give you my take, but
and no consensus answer right yet, because if we'd solved this, we'd be doing it. But yes, I'd be interested in what you think.
So I think I'm really influenced by this theory called the burden of knowledge by Ben Jones, who's an economist at Northwestern. And he kind of argues that pushing forward innovation is sort of a general rule, tends to take more knowledge than what came before. It's not universal, I think, because you can have situations like the computer revolution where something really new happens and you can make big contributions without having a deep well of knowledge. Like you can be a Zuckerberg and found a new company. You don't need to have like a PhD before you have enough knowledge to push the frontier. But most technology, most of the time, is not in that state. And pushing things further requires more knowledge than earlier, because otherwise they would have been solved. Like problems that are left unsolved are the ones that we didn't have enough knowledge to solve at the time. And so that creates this like problem from sort of a management of innovation sector, like mature fields that have been around a long time. They need a lot of knowledge applied to them. And knowledge can only really be applied until we invent AI by humans. And so you got to get knowledge into people's brains. And that means basically large teams of specialists. Okay, so like the way you deploy a lot of knowledge at a problem that needs a lot of knowledge is you get a large team of specialists who are all really deep in one thing, and then you have to coordinate their actions. The problem there is that like innovation, like breakthrough innovation, I think tends to come from putting old components together in a new way, or drawing a connection and seeing that some kind of theory is a useful metaphor for a domain that is different, so we can apply the lessons in this one to another. And if everybody is a specialist, they're super trained in their niche, and they don't necessarily, it's harder to make these connections.
You can't do combination technology across adjacent domains or even faraway domains.
Exactly, right. So the way that companies have tried to get around this is they encourage things like open offices, and they try to get everybody talking to each other all the time. That's sort of like, I think of that as like, we've got this collective brain and we're trying to sort of share knowledge within it amongst each other.
But it's a kind of serendipity process almost. Right,
we're trying to maximize encounters between people because we don't know which ones will be useful. Now, I think that process that's probably wise. When we talk about agglomeration, we can talk about whether you can do that digitally versus whether you have to be in an open plan office. But I think for the point I want to make now is that it probably happens less efficiently when all the knowledge is split across a bunch of people's heads than when it's all in one person's brain. Because you've probably had this experience where you've got a problem and you're just mulling it over like for weeks, and like that's bringing in that process, especially when you like go off work and you do other things, and that activates different parts of knowledge in your brain that are not, you maybe didn't think were related to your problem, and then you have the aha moment maybe, or something like that. And so I think that smaller, an individual who knows everything, who knows that all the specialists know, would probably be able to come up with a more innovative answer than the team of specialists. But those kinds of people are just really expensive and really rare, and it takes a lot of time for them to train, and it might be almost impossible for them to keep up with the frontier in multiple domains of knowledge. That's actually one reason I started the newsletter, is because I feel like this is a growing problem, that people are specialized in different domains and they don't necessarily know what's going on in other domains. And so the goal of the newsletter is actually to like try and digest and synthesize this stuff. And if you see a connection, you can go read that paper maybe, or so on. But there's actually a study and it's just one study, but it's like a new study that looks at this exact problem of the size of teams versus their impact and versus like how disruptive their ideas are. And so like they measure these things differently. Like the impact is measured by how much do you get cited, and the disruption is this index they come up with where if your idea is really disruptive, it means people cite you, but they don't cite the kind of work that you cited. Okay, so it's like you overturned all that previous knowledge, and now people just start with you. Whereas if they cite you in conjunction with lots of other people that you cite, that kind of indicates you're an incremental step in this process. And they find that small teams do a better job at creating these disruptive innovations, and large teams do a better job at creating these high impact innovations. And so I think a problem that we have to deal with as our technological base gets more and more advanced and more complicated is how we continue to find these like really radical breakthroughs when we need bigger and bigger teams in order to sort of advance things. And I think we're still trying to sort of figure that out. So yeah, there's some interesting work that I want to read about like what happens if you embed a generalist who knows a little bit about everything with a team of specialists. Maybe they can be the bridge to see the connections. But like I said, I haven't gotten around to reading it, but that's stuff that'll be in the newsletter, I don't know, sometime.
Sure. Yeah. And it might vary by domain, like you say, mature or maturing ones. We could see, one of the things a lot about, like crop science. If you're working on the crop science for, resistant barley or aubergines, you need to build on a lot of knowledge. But I am still intrigued about even size of teams, because there's one theory, which I guess is stemmed because of Amazon and a few others who kind of have this pizza box theory, which means you basically have 8 to 12 people teams. But I think that's an organizational effect. Whereas if you have 300 people, they can't communicate as effectively. I guess it's that domain transfer. And also you kind of maybe think, oh, well, person X is going to do this because they thought about that. And it's not clear to me which one is actually better, except that if you have these small teams filled with what I guess you pointed out, these very knowledgeable people who know a lot, those are obviously key, whether they're in part of large or part of small. And I do wonder whether it intersects with this idea of, I guess, what is it? The social weak ties idea. So they can connect others because they've got enough domain knowledge to say, oh, you know what? Bob and Fred and Sally all need to speak, because I kind of see something there, even though I might not know enough about how this works. I know enough to know that these people are there, which I guess is an organizational part. But I wonder increasingly, to what you allude to, it's an increasingly important part of how we will do innovation, because you need to now know so much, and you need this mix of small teams, large teams, domain specific knowledge, but then now across many, many domains.
Yeah. And so like one thing I always, whenever I talk to sort of people who are like, know a lot about computers or like AI or machine learning, I always say like, I hope this is an area that, some kind can be solved with some kind of better, artificial intelligence assistance or machine learning assistance, where it sort of spots connections between fields and some is able to say like, you should really talk to this guy, or there's a connection between what you work on and they work on, even though you're not connected socially. So
sure. Okay, so we've got these bunch of people, and we're now we're going to work on a problem. So maybe it's better barley, or perhaps it's how to detect cancer in the blood, which is something we're working on now. Do you think what do you think the mix should be between, say, public funding versus a private corporation, incentive prizes versus, say, tax breaks? So maybe we can work at an even bigger problem. So we're looking on some energy problem, also climate problem, multifactorial, global. How do you think you would plan actual both incentives, funding, and structure to get various teams, whether public or private, and what portion to work on these innovation problems? Let's assume they've got the improving mindset, so we've got the right kind of people. But should we be public? Should we be private? Large teams, small teams, agglomeration? incentive prizes, maybe purchase commitments, depending on what it is. Is it kind of all of the above, or do you feel actually there is from what you read, there is a weighting for one or two of these type of structures and techniques that we do? Or I'll throw in the other one, which I think some people are talking a lot now, like Patrick Collins and the others, that you just need a diversity of these ideas because we're not certain what hits, but we don't have enough of all of the above.
Yeah. So I definitely I think that's like a consensus among lots of people. Says we just need to try a lot more things in a way that we measure. And one, we measure the outcomes. And because like I said, small changes can accumulate. And so they're important to keep track of. But also if we can deploy our experiments in a rigorous way that we can make it more easy to learn from them. I think I'm totally on board with that. And I really hope that we do a lot more of that. But on this other question of like sort of the general question of public versus private or prizes and sort of how you incentivize work on specific things. So I think of like in terms of two, like there's like, it really depends on your time horizon. All right. So if you're trying to solve a specific problem in the short term, whether that's winning a war against the Germans and, the Axis powers, or whether that's defeating the coronavirus, then I think you like high-powered incentives and like specialization and coordinating research works pretty well, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to take the best option that we have that's like we believe is technologically feasible, and we're going to like ramp that up really quickly. So we'll have the Manhattan Project, or we'll have these mRNA vaccines or something like that. And I think that works because, in a short time problem, you don't have like basic research it's like, it takes a long time. It's really risky, and you don't necessarily have the luxury of waiting. And so it's better in that case to just take in the option that you have, and you can, I think the like advanced purchase commitments work pretty well. Profit motive is going to like mobilize resources that people think are likely to solve the problem pretty well. So I looked at the early days of the coronavirus. I wrote one newsletter about studies on how pharmaceutical companies respond to market demand. And essentially, like there's a lot of interesting little natural experiments people have looked at where for whatever reason, there was an increase in demand or willingness to pay for one type of disease than another. And how does that affect the incentives to do research on that disease? And basically, pharma companies follow the profits. They do more R&D. They run more clinical trials on stuff that's going to be more profitable. But the key is that it has a big effect on like third stage clinical trials, or getting a generic drug run through its safety protocols. As you go farther down the chain, it has less and less, or down to like basically zero effect. So like when you might think that, for example, with COVID-19, there's suddenly, if you can solve this problem, you're gonna be enormously wealthy. And so you might think that that's gonna increase R&D across the board for everything by like the same amount. But what you've tended to find was like, there's a huge increase in the number of people looking to see if already approved drugs also had efficacy against COVID-19. You had a lot of people working on vaccine technology. mRNA technology seems miraculous, but like we were very lucky that it was like already ready for prime time when the disease came. It wasn't like they still had to do fundamental research to figure out how to make it work before then. But if you go back, like, you're not going to see people trying to understand how coronaviruses work necessarily with the hope of developing a drug in 10 years or something like that. So
it's very late stage research, but not basic right. research. So actually interesting, if you apply that to something like malaria or antibiotic resistance, this is why actually it may not be working, because the basic research you might need on malaria or AMR, so new set of antibiotics, isn't particularly being incentivized by this type of structure. Am I reading that right?
So what I'm trying to say is that I think like basically incentives work really well for short-term stuff, and they can pull knowledge that's close to being ready into sort of an actual technology. But if you're not there yet, if you have a longer time frame, or if we don't know how to do something exactly, I don't think incentives actually, like profit incentives, work very well in that case. Like, I think in that case, you need to, if you want to tackle climate change, for example, but you don't,
like
the
negative
existing
carbon
technology,
emissions, we don't know how to do it. Or
we don't know
cement.
how to do it. And I think that like funding, like there's a role for funding whatever research you think is most promising for negative carbon emissions, but there's a much, much larger role relative to the other case for just funding anything, because the role of spillovers is so huge. And like, you know, the like the mRNA vaccines, you know, the company was developed, like had that technology ready to go because they were developing stuff for like cancer, to like do like specific gene therapy for specific cancers. But hey, it turned out to have this role here. And like, I've done some newsletters about like trying to quantify how important spillovers are, which is what we call it when like knowledge from another, technically just another person besides the person using the knowledge, like has a benefit to somebody else. So like Apple doing research that benefits Google, or the NIH doing research on a cell signaling thing that turns out to have a thing for like a completely different species and a completely unexpected thing. And in the long run, those things are, I think, the most important thing for driving progress forward. Like if we like, they kind of speak to the fact that innovation is all about doing things we don't know how to do yet, like doing new things. And so if we already knew how to do them, if we already knew, well, this is going to eventually lead to this, and that's going to eventually lead to that, then like it wouldn't be innovation. The whole point is we don't know what's going to lead to what. And so if you want to tackle any like one specific thing, you should just basically fund everything if you have a long enough time horizon. That's sort of my, I don't know, that's my thought. Like,
yeah, if you interesting. So that's a lot more. That's a lot more basic research and things. And my intuition is that seems a bit right, because, you know, we don't really have malaria. You know, malaria vaccines are kind of in trial, and we might have mRNA for malaria, but arguably it's been a bit slow. And that is essentially because countries which have malaria aren't going to pay very much money for it. So there's this profit thing,
right.
Even though you've got some advanced purchase, because it takes you 10 or 20 years and is super risky, and there's some stuff we don't know, that doesn't overcome the fact that, you know, you could develop something for malaria, or you could do flu or cancer vaccines, probably equally risky within what we know, but with a much bigger profit part attached to it. I actually think, incidentally, over the long run, it might prove net slightly advantageous that mRNA came through now, because my current reading is, if it wasn't for something acute, the regulators would have asked for so much data now on, like, well, how much mRNA data would you have wanted before you could prove it would work? If they're going to ask for 10 or 20 year data, that would have actually set back everything you can use mRNA for, which will actually now include cancer, malaria, and all of this. Would have much preferred not to have a pandemic and have a maybe more entrepreneurial regulator, but it doesn't look that way, which kind of thinks that then. So we kind of thought about the corporate lab a little bit, and this need for like teams and specialists and things like that.
Yeah, and I just interrupt really quick to say, like, the big thing is, like, if you also have this really long run perspective where you're wanting to maximize spillovers, then I think that says like a bigger role for things like public agencies, for things that involve the free sharing of knowledge. So maybe prizes rather than intellectual property rights, because you want to maximize people using other people's knowledge. And when you're looking at a short run, like pulling something that's close to prime time into the market, then you can start using, I don't know, targeted profit motive stuff, because I think that works really well. Anyway, but like,
no, yeah, I agree. And in fact, if you're thinking about, say, global inequity or even globalized growth, you can sort of see it through the economic, then actually tech transfer from richer countries to poorer countries in the areas where they could do with that tech transfer actually raises everything. You diminish the inequality and you raise global growth with that. But would be much better suited to a public agency to do those sort of spillovers than private. Which actually brings us to, so with this idea, you've got obviously US ARPA, DARPA, we might have a health ARPA. I don't know, you probably haven't seen, but there's been a French paper out by Blanchard and Tirole, suggesting a French or European ARPA, EU ARPA. UK has its ARPA called ARIA. So everyone wants its own little mini innovation agency. But if you think about the UK ARPA, which I think we're calling ARIA, it's going to have about £500 million. But it's going to need an executive director, and it's going to need, it doesn't really actually, so it's not really looking to be mission aligned, at least not yet. Maybe it will be. But hey, you've been put in charge. You're now going to be the executive director or the person who appoints the executive director. What should UK innovation agency be looking at? I mean, I guess, is it funding everything? Is there a particular structure organization? How should we be thinking about innovation through that? You can choose US Health ARPA if it seems the same for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the lack of a mission focus is, in theory, that's fine because you can just pursue whatever maximizes the public good at the best. But like, I think that a mission state, like having a mission sort of does a nice job of positioning an agency and like helping it. It seems like it helps coordinate it because then you draw related types of people together who have related but not like over, and like you kind of have a nice metric for success and then like a nice justification for ongoing funding in the long run, right? Like, so if you're not going to do that, then like if you're going to fund basic research, for example, basic research takes a really long time for the fruits to become clear and even or to emerge, and they may never be clearly tracked back. So like the political economy of like keeping an organization going, I think without a mission is sort of tricky. But like in general for like all these ARPAs, like my position is like, I think that like it's good to do whatever we want. Like we should be spending a lot more on as society on R&D than we do. Like the returns are really high when you think of them in social terms. So we could probably easily double or triple the amount we spend on R&D before we would have to worry about whether we're
not getting a return,
wasting money.
Yeah.
But so I don't like, when I criticize them, I don't want to like be like, well, so we should just close that down. But I do think that like there's like sort of an excessive hope and faith being put on like the ARPA model right now. Like the evidence base that we have to draw on is just thin because for two reasons. One is like we've got like the old ones like DARPA. We could talk about them in a minute, but then like the newer ones, like, it takes a while to figure out if these things have worked. And especially if their goal is sort of breakthrough innovation, then like you need a lot of data. Because like if you only need one hit every decade, then you might need a few decades of data before you can tell if it's a good investment. But like with DARPA, like I've always wondered like, all right, there's like a couple things that I wonder like, do they make it seem like it was more innovative than it really was? And then so we're sort of doing like a cargo cult thing where we're taking the form of DARPA and just assuming we'll get the same results. So like one is they just spent a lot of money, and maybe that was the secret sauce, is just spending a lot of money. Like two, they were able to recruit the best scientists who were really motivated by the mission of DARPA. Like they really believed in this survival of the United States. They were like people who, like the people who worked for DARPA were like, really, they believed in their mission. And so you have like really smart people motivated with resources. And I think that like in that kind of setting, yeah, giving them more free reign to use their judgment and not tie them up in grant reports and stuff, that sort of makes sense because like they're really, they have sort of this altruistic, at least from their perspective, motive. They're not going to like run away with the funding or like waste it. They're like really concerned about this. Then the resources, and then they've got the talent. So you're going to get great results. If you don't have a mission or whatever, maybe that's harder to achieve. And then the other thing about DARPA is like, because they were a defense agency, they were able to keep, everything got classified. So like all the failures we don't necessarily hear about. So there's a bit of a selection bias. And then the third thing is like, since everything is classified, they can work on something for decades. And then when it finally works, it sort of appears to us ex nihilo, like out of nothing. And it's like, oh my God, look what they did. But like, if they had not been a
27 years.
if they had not been a classified agency, other people would have been following it along, and then somebody else would have picked up the, like, so I read this one book, The Pentagon's Brain, and talk about how they were working on drones since like the Vietnam War. And, if all that stuff had been open and out there, maybe some other company would have picked up the drone technology and advanced it a little bit, and somebody would have, like, it would have been an ecosystem of people doing it, and we would have got there earlier. But it would have emerged more incrementally instead of being seen as this amazing reveal by DARPA on this particular day. And then I think the other thing DARPA had going for it was that because it was not, it was just working on different stuff than everybody else because it had a different mission. And so it was kind of working on stuff that nobody else was working on or not giving the same resources to. And so that generates also the potential for surprises just by being like funding weird stuff, because they're not pursuing the profit motive. They're not doing sort of basic science. They're doing something like kind of orthogonal to both. And since you never know what's going to work, trying something that nobody else is trying is occasionally going to deliver these like big successes that everyone's going to be really surprised by because nobody else is looking at them. So like all of those factors, I feel like don't necessarily hinge on the product manager with a lot of freedom to sort of operate. And so that's kind of my hesitancy about, like, are we putting too much faith in these things? Because maybe what made them work so well was a little bit idiosyncratic and is a little bit hard to replicate.
All of these other factors. So I agree. So I think I would even put it more strongly that we are underinvested in innovation across all of these things. I'd be going much, much higher given the scale of the challenges and returns to all of these aspects. And that is because I partly do think we don't capture some of the value, like I said, on pain, right? That's not captured within it. And I think you will see those benefits. And I'm not utterly convinced that DARPA was necessarily more successful than, say, US venture capital. So it's the same sort of things. But to your point, they were working on other ideas and maybe they had a longer time horizon.
Yes,
but
I would agree with that.
But but they did produce some other good stuff. So I just think, well, why don't we replicate that as that? But it might not have been anything special about DARPA. And I haven't heard your point about the kind of secrecy, non-spillover effects on that. But I'm reflecting that be quite a good thing. I was always taken by two instances in deep patent history. So one is on Japanese semiconductors, where you might be aware that Japanese patent office held up IBM's semiconductor patent in order for its local industry to get a boost up, and they really did. So you can see that. And actually, even going back further in time into the 1800s, there's a lot of work on how the dye industry for colors in, say, France, England, Germany around that time, and what patents and things were doing around there. And in fact, a lot of people moved to Basel in Switzerland. And why we've got such strong pharmaceutical companies in Basel and Switzerland is because the dye manufacturers at the time moved over from France to avoid patents so that they could do more work. It was process at the time and things. So I do wonder about that interplay between how long we should give patents for incentives versus the spillover effects that you get when you've got new ideas coming through. So I guess go on.
Yeah, I mean, that's like the classic problem. And there's like this old quip about like, if we were deciding today whether to start a patent system and we didn't have one, we wouldn't have enough information. We wouldn't have enough evidence to suggest that it's a good idea to start one. But since we do have a patent system, we don't have enough evidence to argue to shut it down. So we might as well keep it going.
Yeah, my personal view is actually patents for certain things are too long and certain things they're too short. But because only I can judge that on an individual basis, and I feel I have that amongst certain drugs and software things, because I can see there's much more value in one and the other and the incentives needed. But I can see how the system could no way ever be able to cope with differential patent life. Some things I think, that was probably only worth 2 years, right? But the incentives for a new Alzheimer's, I'll give you 25 years if you can crack that, because that's going to be so super valuable. Whereas a new type of headache pill is probably at this point in time not going to be that valuable.
Right. Yeah, I think, yeah, I completely agree. If we knew a good way to get to instruct a bureaucracy to implement that kind of thing, that would be ideal. But
Yeah.
we don't know we haven't figured out a way to do it that it wouldn't be captured or something.
Yeah, exactly. I guess I have two questions come to mind. So one is, in hiring people, how much do you think you need formal education for this? So this is kind of the specialized thing. And then the second actually is intersectional of what we just said is, do you think, so Anton Howes thinks copyright should be reformed. There's kind of a lot of copyright thinkers who think that at least copyright's a little bit too long because of that balance. And I was wondering if you had any views on patents, although I guess we've said that it's probably, we are where we are. We don't really have evidence one way or the other. But maybe turning to hiring. So there is some evidence, at least in history, that formal education wasn't really a barrier to invention. And in fact, lack of formal education might have led you to more invention. But more recently, to your point, it does seem that you need a little bit more specialized knowledge in certain areas. But like you say, you do need actually this sensitivity to cross-domain ideas, which is sort of then not formal education in whatever it is this other domain is. So I was wondering what you think about the level of formal education that you might need.
Yeah, I think that it's related to this burden of knowledge thing. In some fields, you need a lot of knowledge to make meaningful contributions. And I think that sometimes I get frustrated by people who I think draw too many lessons from what we did in the distant past, or not distant, but just in the 1800s or first half of the 20th century. And they sort of, look at all these tinkerers, these lone inventors, they were, and I think the nature of innovation for a lot of industries has just changed since then. Like it was possible in some days to just without a formal education or without advanced degrees to just sort of understand a mechanical system, for example. And I've been to I really like going to these, when I used to live in London, it was in DC, they had this thing on the longitude prize where they made these clocks to take at sea to measure longitude. And I love those things because they're right at the cusp of they're so intricate, but you can still look at them and piece out exactly how it's working and sort of understand how the pieces perform their function. And a lot of things are not like that anymore, where somebody can just come in and figure out what's going on and make a meaningful contribution. There still are fields like that. So in that sense, I think that formal education is probably more important now than it was in the past. That said, on the other side of the equation, there's a selection effect where the kind of person who has the improving mentality or is going to want to start a company, develop a new technology, they may be selected out of pursuing enough formal education. And the kind of person who can finish who can be self-denying enough to do their undergrad, their master's, their PhD, and 2 rounds of postdocs, and then apply for all the grants, play the game long enough so that you're in a position to affect change, may not be the kind of person who is there may be a very rare type of person who can do that and also advance it, be an entrepreneur who's going to advance things. So when I listened to your podcast with Anton, I remember him saying, so, you can have teams basically. You don't have to have, you might need some specialists with formal education, and you might be able to have some other people who don't. And I think that that's a pretty reasonable compromise. I mean, that you can have both. And at the end of the day, it's not necessarily the credential that matters. It's just that you do need a lot of knowledge to advance some of these domains. And sometimes you can teach yourself, and sometimes you can get an experience and work in an environment where you can learn that without needing the credential. But I think that, a very common mainstream way to get the knowledge you need to solve major problems is through school.
Yeah. So ideally you need both improving mindset and a reasonable degree of knowledge, if not a whole lot of knowledge, but you might not all be in the same person at the same time. Great. Yep. If you have it in your team, that might be okay too.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then would you reform copyright or patents or both?
Oh yeah. I mean, for copyright, I think copyright is outrageous. It's a scandal, how long it is. 70 years past death, it used to be 28 years, and then you could renew it once to 56.
Yeah.
I thought that seemed a reason. Like, so the issue is like copyright lasts right now an enormous amount of time. I think an insane amount of time. But a patent lasts 20 years. And you might ask, like, well, why is one of them so much shorter than the other? And I think that like copyright is a weaker form of protection in the sense that it protects, not like a patent protects sort of the idea itself. Like I can't just take your same thing and make some small changes and
build on it.
you know, I'm still violating your patent. But with copyright, I can take like the idea of a boy wizard who has to fight a guy who stole some of his soul and goes to a wizard school. I can take that idea, and as long as I'm like, that could be the core thing that makes that series of books popular, and I can just steal that as long as I'm not calling my characters Harry Potter and not making them like super identifiable as supposed to be the same thing. So like, so in that sense, copyright is a weaker form of protection, so it makes sense that you get a longer period to capitalize on it. But I still think that like, the current length is crazy and is driven not by, so like, I remember I did this calculation once where like, say you're at, I can't remember what I said, like say you're at 20 years and you're going to extend it to 50. If you discount the future value of money at 5% per year, like what's the difference between as you extend it, you only get like the present value of that, of an income stream that, say your book is going to sell $10,000 a year in perpetuity. The present discounted value at 5% is like, I don't know, I think it's like 50 or 500,000 or something. I can't remember. I'm doing my math wrong. Sorry on the pie. But anyway, like if you are only have it for 20 years versus 50 years is a very small difference. Yeah. Like, and so like, but the person who it really matters to is somebody whose copyright is about to run out. For them, like there's an enormous difference between 0 more years of protection and another 50 years of protection. Yeah. And like, so they have an intense incentive to lobby to extend copyright. And they've been successfully doing that around the world. And the problem is that it has like no impact, or such a small impact on the reason we have copyright, which is like motivate people to create new things.
Creativity.
Because all that extra, and I think it just locks up ideas that would be profitably recycled and remixed and stuff like that. So I would love to go back to, a drastically shorter copyright. I don't know, like 50 years at the max. And I don't know, I could be convinced that like something like that is appropriate, but I'm like, my bias is towards something that's more like the length of a patent. Yeah. As for patents, I don't have as much to say. I think it's a lot fuzzier what the appropriate length is. Like we've already kind of alluded to some of these things. I think that they do lock up ideas. I think that a lot of patents are a net drag on innovation rather than a benefit, but there are some domains where patents are really important, and innovations probably wouldn't happen in some kinds of fields without patent protection.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think on copyright, special interest, essentially publishers and the like, and maybe artists in the top 0.001% have this locked up. The average, say, artist or writer, it does seem to be harmed by it. And then you've got these orphan works and all of this, and it hasn't kept up to date with technology, the way that you enforce it and all. I think that's all right. But I am intrigued on patents, because actually if you go back before we had TRIPS and all of the patent system, much wider variety on patent length terms. And like you say, actually in hindsight, you can identify what maybe deserves longer and deserves shorter, but I don't know of any bureaucracy which could handle that.
Yeah, I mean, because you would want to have it be based on something like, you want to provide sufficient incentive so you could have a longer copyright if you need more money, if you need more time to recoup your investment at a reasonable rate or something like that. But who's going to tell you the honest length of time it took them? How are you going to monitor that? It's tricky.
And exactly. I mean, so I spent quite a long time looking at biopharmaceutical patents. And there's only a handful of us in the world who can really like look and assess that. You've got process patents, substance patents, crystallization patents. Then you look at the health economics. Was it incremental? Did they really do it? Was it a family? Were they building on other classes and things? And all of this knowledge, and we judge about whether it's valid or not, or how much prior art and things. Yeah, and this is the whole specialist knowledge. It's like maybe for each individual drug class, there's maybe 1,000 people who really understand what that value is, and they can reasonably disagree within some bounds.
So this is a good point for me to ask you a question then. So if I was to ask what is like, what's an area that really seems to depend on patents, I would have said pharmaceutical. Like innovation in pharmaceuticals seems like one of the best arguments you could make for the value of patents. And I would have said it's because most of the value created by a drug is the knowledge that it is safe and effective, not necessarily how you manufacture it. And so it's hard to protect that knowledge. Like once it's out there, like you need a patent to protect it, because otherwise everyone knows like, oh, this compound we now know cures headaches and doesn't cause any side effects, so we can make it and sell it too. But since you're a person who reads patents in pharmaceutical and like this whole, what is your take on the value of patents in medicine?
So I agree. There's quite a few complexities. One of the most obvious ones actually is that, so roughly 20-year life on your patent from when you discover, say, the white powder drug or say the mRNA formulation. But on average, it's taking you 8 to 12 years to get it through regulatory development. So your effective commercial patent life on average, again, it can vary, is actually only 10 years. So even when you compare this to the software family patents, because your development cycle is much quicker, you've got way less time. And if you compare it to, say, software patents, you've got this kind of family patent and you build on that. And you can kind of keep hold of that as the large tech companies have, like almost in perpetuity, right? Which you can't do within pharma, at least with white powder chemicals, slightly different for biological. But for white powder, once you have the chemical structure and that's known, and then your patent's gone, it can be copied for, like you say, the actual chemical manufacturing is extremely cheap, like cost you a few cents for something. Then that is not where the value accretion has occurred. But then because it's only actually 10-year commercial life, you have all of these other strange effects of where you try and play essentially patent games to get more life because of that value. But fundamentally, if you can tell what I would call sort of unmet medical need, or you could translate that into health economics, where you could see that if you had a cure for cancer, Alzheimer's, or malaria, that is more valuable than a headache pill today. So arguably, I could give you a 30-year patent on say you've got a cure for Alzheimer's. I can give you a 30-year patent, and the NPV, the net present value to humanity, is still going to be enormously large. Whereas headache pills, given what we have and where we are today, I'll give you 2 or 3 years to do something if you could do something incrementally better. But quite frankly, you're not that much better than ibuprofen or aspirin or something else. So actually, I don't really need to incentivize you to do anything else, because society has something decent. But we have nothing for Alzheimer's, nothing for malaria. And in fact, you can go on because there's quite a lot of healthcare needs. And so I would want to incentivize you more. Yes, you can do this maybe with some advanced purchase commitments and other things, but they're way not as good as patents, to do with the fact that you need also them to do, as you alluded to earlier, the basic research stuff in some of these areas, particularly in, say, the brain sciences like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, depression, and you can go on, where we still don't understand that basic research. And some of that's coming out of universities and other publicly funded, but some of it could come really nicely out of corporate labs if they had the incentive to be able to do that, because of the long time horizon and also an incredible risk, which people don't understand. So again, 10 years that it takes you when you discover the white powder drug, and before you put it in humans, your average chance of success is around about 1%. So you've only got a 1 in 100 chance, and it's going to cost you anywhere between 500 million to 2 billion to develop that. So this is why also it probably doesn't suit governments, because governments can't afford to spend $1 billion on something and turn to the public and go, well, you know what? We knew it was a 1 in 100 chance. The NPV would be great if it was Alzheimer's, but you know what? We wasted that billion. We did get some spillovers, but hey, you can't count that. And so again, patents uniquely do that.
Yeah, that reminds me, like, so there's this, the typical view of like why we have patents is you do all this R&D, somebody can copy you, and so you need protection to charge price above cost for a little bit of time, make profit. Can you still see me? Okay. To make profit, to compensate you for the R&D you did. It's like they call this like the reward function of patents. But there's this other perspective by a guy named Kitch that he calls it the prospect function of patents. And that's like sort of what you were saying, where one of the roles of patents is actually to carve out a space for an organization to develop a product that actually isn't ready to sell yet, knowing that they can kind of work freely in this domain without worrying that somebody's going to take their ideas. So, and also to prevent the duplication of effort. So for example, if we gave Alzheimer's patent for, like you said, maybe 40 years to some company, that company has like a long time horizon that it knows, like all research that it does related to the mechanism that it has the patent for is its to kind of work on. And so it's kind of like, he likens it to like giving like a land claim for like a mine. Like the person who owns the mine has the incentive to develop it and like go down and dig and do all that stuff because they know that they get to own whatever comes out of that. And by giving a patent to like an organization, like to a specific pharma company, we prevent duplicative, wasteful effort, people trying to do research on the same mechanism at the same time. They can do other things knowing that that company is doing its own thing. And so I've heard people say that that function of patents is actually like it works pretty well still, or like coordinating research. So like, well, that's those guys' thing.
It works really well in pharmaceuticals. So take the Alzheimer's example. Mm-hmm. So you've got something called amyloid beta, which is one big hypothesis within Alzheimer's. So say you locked up the A beta hypothesis, or other people could do other A beta mechanisms, but you were given a 40-year claim on that. A lot of people would then look at Alzheimer's, but look at another mechanism, which wouldn't compete within that class, but you know that Alzheimer's is really valuable. There's actually a very current debate because US FDA has approved an Alzheimer's drug, which scientists debate its value for in that particular drug. But it's really interesting that you can see it has very much excited companies and investors for follow-on drugs. So the actual benefit to society is, at least in my view, unlikely to be in this particular drug, which has got pros and cons, but with the follow-up incentives, because people have gone, you know what, I'm not canceling my phase 2 50-50 Alzheimer's program. I'm going to invest in it more because I actually now know that the regulatory barrier to this was not as high as I perhaps thought, which is a kind of interesting thing. The flip side saying that maybe that mechanism of action is not the one to go for. Okay, so this brings me to, we can do a little bit in honor of Emergent Ventures, Tyler Cowen, a bit of underrated, overrated. But the little trick here is what, you might have heard this on one of the others is what maybe Phantom Tyler might think. So you could try whether you think it's underrated, overrated, and then what do you think that Tyler would think? So this is the idea that we don't actually need the real version of Tyler. We can just have the version of Tyler in our head, and he might scale maybe a little bit better than you would have thought. He can actually be everywhere at once because he's in our brain.
All right. It's very exciting to get to play overrated or underrated. I never got to play before.
Right. So maybe let's start with agglomeration effects. So maybe city agglomeration effects. Do you think overrated, underrated?
Oh, I totally think these are overrated. This is my whole thing. That doesn't mean that I think that they're zero or that they're just exist.
Overrated.
I think they're overrated though. I think though that the world is catching up a bit with having seen that remote work functioned not just for like 6 weeks, but for like over a year without notable huge downsides or anything. And I think that the thing that's interesting is you can see this, like, I had written a paper trying to synthesize a lot of stuff about remote work, and one of them was about knowledge spillovers. And very few papers try to measure how knowledge spillovers, which is people learning from other people who are geographically close from them, but maybe not in the same firm or whatever, very few papers have tried to measure how that has changed over time, because there's just kind of been this assumption that, well, what's interesting is what is it, and then we just kind of assume that it stays like that for decades. But when papers do try to measure how it's changed over time, they tend to find that it's been declining for decades. Like, the propensity to cite patents that are local declining, the propensity to incorporate new words for new technologies used to be much higher in big cities rather than median cities. Other stuff like, I don't know, there's like, you can look at academics citing papers that are close or far away in their department. The value they get from moving to a high department has been, in terms of their own personal productivity, has been declining. So like I said, I think there's lots of evidence that the internet and travel have basically eroded the value of being physically co-located in the same city as other knowledge workers. They haven't eliminated it, but it is a lot less than people think. And the reason that's important is because there are countervailing benefits to not being agglomerated, that when the benefits of agglomeration begin to fall, those other benefits may start to become dominant. For example, the ability to pick just the right person for the position, like the right specialist, if you're not limited to your local labor market, I think becomes ever more important as this burden of knowledge problem happens. I need to get just the right person who knows just about the right kind of thing, and they may not live in my city. And if we don't benefit that much from being physically co-located, it might be a lot better for me to get the right person rather than the person who I can work with close. So that's my little rant on agglomeration.
Yeah, great.
What would Tyler say?
What would Tyler say? Well, I guess that means you're then cautiously pretty optimistic about remote working, and probably all of the fuss on innovation clusters. It's a thing, but actually it's of a diminishing return. Yeah, what would Tyler say? I don't know what would Tyler say.
I don't know what Tyler would say. I don't know if he's written about agglomeration effects before. I'm trying to think. But I think that he would say they are either, I think he's maybe opposite from me, or at least thinks that the conventional wisdom is correct. Like, he talks about the Vienna Circle and sort of the value of like these highly innovative cities and trying to figure out what made them special. And so he might be more cautious than me about,
we might check. So I know he's very pro travel, but I'm not sure about agglomeration. Well, we'll see.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Let's go for GDP as a measure.
GDP as a measure, I think I've got the boring consensus view of economists, which is, terrible, but except for everything else. Like, right. It's like, it's correlated with lots of stuff that people do care about. And so that should give us some confidence in it. It misses a lot. I think if you're aware of what it's missing, then you can, you wouldn't want to fetishize it, like where you start to focus only on it and ignore everything else. But it's very like incorporating that other stuff is, just adds extra layers of complexity and subjectivity if you're trying to incorporate measures of well-being. There are some kind of, this reminds me of like a quote from, there's an innovation economist, Alberto Galasso. I don't think you'll get mad if I share it, but I was asking him once, like, what do you think about patents as a measure of innovation? Because this is a big debate among economists who study innovation, that patents are like this terrible, are they good, or are they good enough, or are they super misleading measure of innovation? And he was sort of like, this really frustrates me because like nobody bothers all the economists who use GDP, but it's not like that's perfect. Like we always get this question, but I'm not sure those other guys do. Anyway, is it overrated or underrated? I'd say it's correctly rated. It's correctly rated. I think most people have that view.
Yeah. Okay, that's fair.
And what would Tyler say? Tyler is I think he would, I think, echo a lot of the same concerns. He's got his wealth plus concept in stubborn attachments. So I think he would probably have a similar take. That's my guess on Phantom Tyler.
Yeah, I'd agree. Although I do think he notes that GDP does correlate with so many things that we do actually think are great. Yeah. So he would probably say, show me something better, which I guess is the same with TFP. I guess it's the same with democracy, right? Show me a better system. We know it's pretty imperfect, right. But until I see something better, I'm not gonna I'm not going
and
to.
I don't know if there's that much appetite at the moment for overturning it and changing it to something else. Like I don't know. I haven't heard a lot of calls.
Well,
for that.
there is a New Zealand living budget, which I think is the closest that you're going to get to looking at something which is GDP plus, which is being done seriously by a country and looked at by their government economists and things to look at that. But essentially it is trying to put natural capital and human capital elements in how they think about it. So that would be a step on, but it's not completely different to what you would think.
Right.
Okay. Aubergines, or what you guys would call eggplant, particularly maybe with aubergine yields or crop yields.
Aubergines. I don't know that much about. I know that I believe there was like a famous paper about GMO aubergines that found that they were like the GMOs were spectacular for a developing country context, and so that's good. In general, I'm pretty happy with GMOs. As for aubergines, I think that they're probably a little underrated, at least in the USA. Like they're as a food, I think they're not part of the staple of any main meals, but like prepared well, they're
really good, and they could be pretty good for yields as well. Okay. I don't know what Tyler would think about aubergines.
I know it's hard for me to guess because he's eaten too many. He's got sophisticated views on food, I guess.
Yeah, I would go underrated because I think he thinks a lot of food in general is underrated. Okay, NFTs or non-fungible tokens. This is blockchain type thinking.
This is tricky. They're obviously like it's with all crypto things. There's like this huge polarization where they're like, it's like probably massively overrated by people in the community, or at least overrated to some extent by people in the community. I don't want to say massively necessarily, and then maybe underrated by other people. It's like something because like there's this huge polarization of people who think that it's just like. I don't agree with people who think that like they're just a scam, like that there's nothing to it. But also like. I guess one view I have on crypto is that I think people who are crypto enthusiasts maybe underrate how long it's going to take these ideas to become mainstream or like have a significant impact. Like new technologies just tend to take decades to wind through an economy and for people to figure out how best to deploy and use them. And over that time frame, they can be really significant. And we've kind of got a weird case where like remote work has leapt forward probably several years into the future because we had this crazy event where, we all had to use this new technology. It's like, if we had, I think of it like if we had been in like the 1800s and there had been some disease that that came from steam engines, but not from electricity or something, like how that would have changed accelerated the transition to like electrification or whatever. And like, that's an outlier. Like, how quickly people are adopting remote work and moving to these remote first companies, I think like that's a really weird thing. And other technologies like NFTs are going to take longer. But there is this, I read this newsletter from a guy, Packy McCormick, and he used an NFT to like try to allocate revenue from a product from a newsletter he wrote to people he did, which I thought was an interesting idea.
Yeah. What do you think, Phantom Tyler?
Let's see. I think so. He's often said like, crypto stuff is he's waiting for a real good use case for them, and this being a potential use case, maybe he thinks that this is a good thing. On the other hand, maybe he lumps it in with his other crypto usual concerns. So maybe he thinks that they're slightly underrated, but I have low confidence in that answer.
Yeah, I think you think they're underrated, but I agree with you that they probably are overrated if you are a guy with laser eyes, but actually for the average person in the street, actually don't really touch crypto. So for them, it is underrated. And I do think NFTs do have a genuine use case. I don't know how large it will be, but I think it is a genuine, case. Okay, maybe last one on the overrated, underrated, science fiction.
Oh, science fiction. I think it's probably. I mean, it's too. I think for it to be underrated, it would have to mean that people who would like science fiction are not reading, like are avoiding it because they underrate it, and if they just gave it a try, they would really like it. And there's some newer science fiction. There's like new, maybe it's not new, but there's science fiction that's being done, I feel like, by authors who do not traditionally, who are not solely genre writers, and but they've started dabbling in it. And I think that stuff appeals to people who don't traditionally like science fiction. But I do think that like people who like, if you think of like hardcore genre science fiction, which I like, I should say, I'm organizing a econ Twitter science fiction reading thing, and we're reading A Deepness in the Sky, a book by Werner Vinge, which is amazing, and everyone should read it who is interested in this kind of thing. Because that's the thing, like, I think that a lot of people who think they wouldn't like science fiction, I mean, obviously if they could get the right book point, but like if they picked something off the shelf, I wouldn't be surprised if they are like, yep, I don't like this. Like, because like it does have like genre science fiction is like very preoccupied with certain kinds of things that if you're the kind of person who's also preoccupied with them, they're fantastic. But if you correctly understand that you're not, then yeah, like you're probably not going to like it that much. Like A Deepness in the Sky is very great if you're interested in how like very long run science and technology, how that's going to look for the human race, and kind of economics of innovation questions and stuff like that. But if you think that's all boring and you just want like if you want a story about somebody's like internal journey, it's not the place to go. But
surely that means it's underrated, right? Because more people should be thinking about the very long term and innovation questions.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's a good argument to say that it would be good for more people to read optimistic science fiction, or at least, yeah, I would say. I think that's probably true, and I think that I think that's true. It'd probably be good if we could make more high quality optimistic science fiction television. We'll probably get that'll probably have a bigger impact than more reading.
And Phantom Tyler.
I don't know, Tyler. It's really hard to like guess Tyler's reading.
You think? Oh,
opinions.
I'm.
But I think for the reasons you said, he might be optimistic, or he might agree with what you said.
I'm strong conviction on science fiction. Mm-hmm. He would definitely think. I think science fiction is underrated for all of those reasons, and also because I think he is a science fiction reader. But that's my guess.
Cool.
Okay.
Cool.
So maybe turning to the slightly personal career journey is what do you think maybe physics and religious studies has informed you to do with anything with economics, or also because I know you studied some of that, this idea that you can, I guess it's a kind of liberal arts thing, but this idea that you can swap specialisms or have things across domain, has that been useful to you?
So I was when I was in high school, I was really interested in like world religions, basically. Like, what do all the different religions, and sort of this view that all the different religions are sort of trying to find the same core truth, and they're all approaching it from different angles. And so that was a question I really wanted to pursue in college. And so I did religious studies, but my parents were like, very wisely, that this is a poor career strategy. And so they said, they encouraged me to do something quantitative. And so I compromised by doing a double degree in religious studies and physics, because I figured this would be like a pincher attack on truth anyway. Like, we'd learn about the nature of the universe from both sides. And, I think that experience definitely like informed who I am. I'm not particularly religious right now, or a physics person. So I don't know, read into that as you would, but what did I take away in terms of economics? Like, the reason I went into economics is I didn't really know anything about what economics as a field was. Like when I was an undergrad, I didn't know any economists really, and I'd never read popular economics books. It was just something that existed on the Wall Street Journal page or something. And I read Atlas Shrugged and Guns, Germs, and Steel when I was a junior, trying to figure out what I was going to do, because I had decided I wasn't going to be a religious studies scholar or a physics scholar. I don't really, it's not like I buy Ayn Rand's objectivism or anything like that, but it was the first time I'd been exposed to thinking of economics as this sort of engine that runs the world, as like that is like super important. And then Guns, Germs, and Steel was like, you can study big important questions about society very quantitatively. And so religious studies is the study of world religions, and we read a lot of text, but it's in some ways more, it wasn't a quantitative field as I was taught it. And physics was super quantitative. And so it just seemed like, so realizing that these two things could kind of go together and that they might go together in the field of economics was what brought me to that field. Like, it's an important thing and it's quantitative and rigorous. Not that other stuff can't be rigorous too, but that was my bias, I guess. And so I went. That's what led me to choose to become an economist. And I think that's all been proven correct. What do I still take away from it? I mean, I still read pop physics books. I try to keep up with physics, and I still do think about very ultimate questions. It's not like I write about them on my Substack, because I don't know if they're better than anybody else's, but I still like think about those things, and I think they give you a useful big picture about what you want to do with your career in your life. So.
And I think you studied in London and Cambridge. How does that compare to Iowa or even US versus? Well, I would say UK, but there is something specific about, actually, the London, Cambridge, Oxford, Southeast is probably considered the only UK agglomeration thing on that. But very different. Cambridge, Iowa, I guess.
Yeah, they were very different. I mean, how I got into it was I knew that I wanted to study economics. I had no training in economics except for one class that I took and an online class that I took and the books that I read. And the University of Cambridge offers this program called the Diploma in Economics, which is like designed for people in that position. It's like a compressed 1-year undergraduate education in economics for people who have an undergraduate degree in something else. And then the goal is that it's the first year of, then the next year you can go on and get a master's or something. So I did my master's at the London School of Economics, and I worked as like an economic analyst. So that's what took me to the UK, is just to like do this degree, but also I had studied abroad in Ireland and really enjoyed the experience of living somewhere besides the United States. And so I was really open to trying something different. It's a very different system. Like, the US system is like very piecemeal or like spaced out. Like, we have lots of little assignments that are evaluated and count towards your grade throughout the entire semester. And so the final is it wouldn't be uncommon for the final exam to be, 15% of your total mark, and everything else is from midterm exams and homeworks that you did and participation and a huge mix of stuff. And in both University of Cambridge and London School of Economics, it was all just an end of year exam, was pretty much the entirety of your thing. And so the first year at Cambridge, I didn't do I did fine, but I didn't do great on my exams because I had no idea how to sort of study for these kinds of high stake everything exams. And so that was a learning curve that I think I got over for the London School of Economics. I figured out how to productively study for that kind of thing. But then the funny thing is, so now I teach at Iowa State University, and I've slowly gone from like a more UK style to a more US style in how I teach my own classes. Because the thing I like about the UK style is it's very, there is a moment in time when you sort of in theory know everything that, you studied in that year. Whereas in the US, things can kind of filter in one ear and out the other after they go on the exam. And maybe you suffer a penalty because at the end of the semester you can't remember, but that's only 10% of your grade anyway, or something like that. Or you cram and you get a little bit. But like with the UK system, you really know everything at that moment, and it's a nice system. Like, all right, at least at this one moment in time, this person this is a good measure of what this person learned over the year. So I tried to do a system like that in the US, where most of the exams counted for almost all your weight, and then you could get some extra credit from doing the homework as a way to incentivize people to keep doing the homework in a culture where people are not used to the idea that if they haven't had the experience of not doing it and then getting burned at the end of the semester. And it didn't work at all. Like
couldn't cope with the cultural difference. Yeah,
the culture, like the expectation of students is just too different. Like in a class where they're not being continually evaluated on things, they have opportunity costs, and there's other classes where they are being evaluated on stuff at the moment. So that the stuff in the class that it's only the final gets shunted down the way, and and then, they don't have experience with knowing how badly that will burn them. And so then I don't do that anymore, basically. But I still think that there's merit. I think there's merit to it, but it's, it's also it's very high stress and high stakes.
Yeah, so it's different. But I do think, and I think there's pros and cons about, but the one thing about that UK system is because you do need to basically assess yourself, whether you think you know something all the way along the year to like get to that endpoint. And actually that sometimes reflects things in companies, because depending on the companies or even whatever walk in life you need actually a particularly brilliant manager to be able, or whoever's above you, to be able to give you constant feedback to tell you, you know what, you're doing okay, right? You could do this project this month and week. Usually you don't get, like the average worker doesn't get told anything, and they might have a big project or not. But generally you kind of don't know what you're doing. Maybe you have an annual review. Mm-hmm. Small companies don't really even have annual reviews. So unless you've got a built up some way of knowing how you're doing, you actually then tend not to do that well. And that's something you have to then learn on the job. On the other hand, having the big project at the end that is not always the same as all companies, but that sense of being your own self-evaluator as opposed to, okay, I just took a quiz every week, so I knew and had to do it, is a kind of different way of thinking, which is interesting. I don't know which one's better, but they
I like that the UK system also builds in autonomy, like, and you have to self-motivate, and you have to decide on your own study. And I think those are good skills to learn for life. Whereas the US system can be more like just follow the plan laid out for you by the instructor. And then when you graduate and you don't have a plan anymore, you might be in trouble.
Great. So a couple of last things, I think. One, I'd love to hear you on about remote work, but maybe before that, because I know you studied a little bit on sub-Saharan Africa, also some countries there. I've been interested, do you think there's anything we particularly misunderstand about sub-Saharan Africa? I'm sure there's lots, but something which you kind of see and like, oh, if you could understand this would just give you a lot better insight, because I guess most people don't.
It's tough. I mean, for sub-Saharan Africa, that was my first job, and it was kind of assigned to me. I went to work for this company to be an economic analyst, and they were like, you will have these countries. And so I didn't have a pre-existing knowledge or like expertise on them. And I was always nervous about, if I had sufficient depth of knowledge over this thing. I think one big thing is just that, it's an enormous, diverse place. Like
it's big.
Africa is not a country. It's it's many countries. It's enormous. It's got, that's like probably one big misconception, or I mean, people know that, I suppose, but like they don't internalize it, and they think it's just sort of Africa. But that's I'll leave it at that, because to be honest, this company never even like paid for me to visit, and so I don't I don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn, basically.
That's fair. And so remote work. So you've done some interesting stuff, actually, which you've got to find off a separate blog, because it's not all on your Substack. But I get the sense, pretty cautiously optimistic about both the emerging work and what it might mean for people. So I don't know whether you want to sum up what your current thinking is about how remote work might work in the future for us.
Yeah. So I've been working on remote work for a couple of years. Before coronavirus, and it started because I live in Iowa, which is in the central United States. It's a small, it's like a primarily agricultural state with these problems of like declining population, and what jobs can be done. Especially, we don't have like a major urban, we don't have a big city. Like the biggest city is under 1 million people, and so I was, there had been all these. This is sort of in the era when Trump had been elected, and there was all this talk about the urban-rural divide, and there were a number of plans that had been put out about like ways to sort of revitalize parts of America that are not, you're muted there, but ways to revitalize the parts of America that have been left behind by like agglomeration forces and stuff. And I just thought that most of the plans that were suggested were sort of I wasn't really happy with them. So there was like plans to sort of make research centers, instead of in a few cities, pick like 20 different research centers, or maybe even just 10 around the country, and pour research money into those places, or revitalize small liberal arts college towns, or just give people money to move to the big cities. And I didn't think that these were very good, but I thought remote work was potentially useful, like pretty potentially useful. If you can do the jobs of the agglomeration economies without having to live in them, this is a way to sort of tether left behind regions to the modern economy. And so I started getting into that, and I knew I had some personal experience working remotely in my previous job as the Department of Agriculture, and I had been always paying attention to this issue of knowledge spillovers. And so I started looking a lot more, and I thought that there was basically a good case to be made that the outlook for remote work was a lot stronger than people appreciated, because I felt like the arguments for remote work, this is all pre-coronavirus, were fragmented across many different social science domains, and there weren't people who had attempted to pull all the threads together. Like, you have economists who are labor economists who study remote work directly, and they do experiments where they sort of see how well do people work when they work at home versus in the office, and they do experiments where they randomize people to one or two arms of this treatment. And they tended to find that remote work was pretty effective. Like, often they would find more effective than people in the office. So that was one strand of literature, and they were kind of advocating for it, but wasn't like they were super passionate about it. Then you had other people who were working on like online labor markets and like developing algorithms to match workers to firms, or working for Upwork. There's this guy, John Horton, who's done experiments on the design of the Upwork platform to match remote freelancers to things. And other people who've looked at the effect of the internet on job search, and just all this stuff basically that finds that, how does the internet facilitate job search? And one of the problems with remote work has been, well, even if you can do the job remotely, how do you find the job that's a good fit? And one of the promises of remote work is that you'll be able to hire just the right person for this job. They're not local. But if you don't know where they are, if they're not, like, how do you find them? And with online labor markets and algorithmic recommendations, that problem starts to get solved. And then on the third side, you have people who do like study online social networks, and they're looking at the geographic footprint of our social networks and how that's expanding. And so whether these things let us, like, how many of my friends live close and how many of them live far away? And I don't think there's exactly work on remote work there, but just the idea that people tend to meet people who live nearby, but when they move away, there's a lot of, those connections seem to persist pretty well. And I think it's because of all the modern technology that makes it easy to stay in contact. And so a lot of jobs are found through these informal social networks. And if your informal social network is now spread out geographically, that becomes another avenue. And then the last piece of the puzzle was just that the knowledge spillovers I knew had been falling for a while. And so I tried to write a comprehensive survey of all these different things and put them in one place and say, look, the case for remote work is a lot stronger than any one of these individual groups recognizes, because all these things go together. And it's basically, the case is that the technology for performing work remotely has gotten a lot better. And so many jobs can be done remotely pretty well. We've done experiments on different kinds of works, and that seems to be the case. And even if I'm only 95% or 90% as effective working remotely as I am in the office, if you can find a person who's 20% better, because they're not local, then that's good for the firm. Or you can think about if I'm only 90% as effective, but I don't have to commute at all, then like on a per hour basis, it makes sense for me to just stay home, and you can change my compensation maybe or something so that you're getting the same value for money. And basically, I wrote the case for remote work. I'd started it, and then coronavirus hit, and I was like, I better get this thing out quick. And then I feel like that has been like so vindicated that it's almost boring now. Like maybe it's a little bit too, maybe that's too soon to say, but I think everyone's like, everything that's been followed up, there's been a lot of work since then. And like, it's like workers are like pretty much across the board, like it works better than we thought. I'm as productive. And a lot of people say they're more productive working at home. Companies are realizing this, and it's just like, I don't know, it's like, it's a very weird case. I thought this was going to play out over decades and that we should like incrementally make policies that make remote work easier, but instead we had this huge shock that happened. Looking forward, I think the biggest unknown about remote work is about the formation of social networks, like informal social networks. So right now we're kind of riding on the social capital developed from lifetimes of working in the office and in cities. And that has all these benefits of like, you know, I go to parties with my coworkers and I meet their friends. Yeah. And if it's a city that's a cluster, they might work in the same industry or a related industry. And we build this whole network up. And that's this really valuable thing, because that can give me job recommendations. That can be a place I turn to for advice about, should I hire this person? Are they really good? I'm sorry, if I have a question about an area of technical capability, you know, I know people who I can ask. I am aware that there might be technical capabilities that I could use for some new innovation because I've talked about it at a party. And like, if we all scatter, which I don't think we're going to all scatter, but you know, is that going to slow down innovation? And I think the big unknown is how much of that can be recreated with the internet. Like, so I have made a lot of professional contacts through Twitter, and Twitter is in some ways like a bar that you hang out and randomly meet people. And the thing about Twitter is like a lot of the interactions are not as good as if you were co-located face to face. Like they're more fleeting. It's harder to form a deep connection, but you are interacting with an order of magnitude more people. And so I think we don't know to what extent those things balance out. And then, you know, you have things like, other social networks. You have conferences people go to, and they could maybe do all their socializing in one place there, and then, you know, meet a bunch of people. And in the past, I would have met them, but nothing much would have come of it. But now I meet a bunch of people, and we keep in contact over Twitter and Facebook or email. And so I'm able to form informal social networks in that way, almost as efficiently as if we all lived in the same city. And I think that we just don't know. Like, this is the big unknown. But I think it is probably important. I still think that even if it turns out we can't form informal social networks as well online, or you know, maybe that's a big demerit, there's still a lot recommending remote work because it has all these other advantages that are sort of compensating. But that's my current big concern about the future of remote work, is that side of it.
Okay, yeah, I think that's fair. I think there will be these compensating, but the weak tie, social network, the serendipity, and also for a category of jobs where you need what I would say, you need to face-to-face works better. A classic example would be a master carpenter. So if a master carpenter wrote their stuff in a book, probably you can't really follow it, maybe a bit. Yep. You probably can learn a reasonable amount if you followed them on video. So YouTube would help, but you will obviously earn a lot more if you can actually be in the same room and follow them. And there might be a class of the things, you know, the soft skill knowledge, process, and know-how that you need for master carpentry. But actually that master carpentry category of jobs might be smaller than we thought, or rather that the category of jobs where the video is good enough. Yeah, the video might not work for master carpentry, but it probably works for baking a cake. Might not work and chef, but it might work for these other things. I think that's true. The one other note I would say is that actually I think senior business leaders who, what I would say, are maybe from more old school industries or have older school ties are less keen on remote work. Hybrid, I don't know, because I think that's where the compromise is going to be. But actually, so if you're tech Silicon Valley or you're, whatever, like the CEO of Gravity Payments or Coinbase, you were on virtually remote anyway beforehand. You've done that. But actually, the CEO of JP Morgan, much more reticent. So I don't know. Those are my two reflections on that.
Yeah. I think that people who grew up, who became CEOs in the old system, obviously are people who know how to flourish in a certain domain, and you wouldn't expect that they're necessarily going to be the people who would also flourish to the same extent in a different kind of organization. So that was one reason I always thought this was going to be a slow thing to play out, because it would be led by companies forming from remote from the beginning, and then you'd have this ever-growing cohort of people who have experience managing and leading remote companies, and they would spread out. Now we're in this weird situation where we're having companies that existed and were set up a one way deciding to switch because for these kind of reasons, and they've paid the switching costs in terms of they've developed processes to do things remotely, and they've invested in the equipment. Coronavirus forced them to do that. But, in some way, they being remote first isn't necessarily in their DNA in the same way it would be for another company. And as to your first point, that's probably something I should have said right at the beginning, is I don't think this is ever going to be 100%. Well, ever is a long time. But in the next few decades, I don't see us going 100% remote at all. I sort of target 20 to 30% of workers being being mostly remote. And I think that's the thing is that's still a huge change. If you had some new industry that was 20% of people and it could be done from anywhere, it seems like that's a really good thing for places like Iowa and so on.
And whole categories of job, like call center, to the extent that it wasn't going to go AI, and you still think, actually, you know what, a person would be better than the person at home can completely do maybe that remotely. On that. So I do think that's true.
Yeah. And what you're saying also about the value of being face-to-face, I totally agree with that. That's one thing that I changed my mind about doing all those researches. When I first started, I was like, what do you really need to be face-to-face for when in the era of Zoom? It's just people being Luddites or something. But reading more, and it's just it continually comes up again that even knowledge workers who are comfortable with it, they like to have occasional in-person things. So WordPress has been fully remote for 20 years or whatever, but I think they have quarterly things where teams get together in person and there's a study of Google, and they have people working all over the world, and they talk about how valuable it is to have, when you're starting a new project, get everybody in one place to get on the same page. And then you kind of figure out the roles and the tasks that need to be done. And then it's a lot easier to then, in a sense, you're sort of breaking the problem down into discrete chunks that then make sense to do remotely where people can focus. But yeah, I think that fully remote, it's not everybody, it's never going to be everyone. And it's not even going to be that people never see each other. They just will sort of see each other intensely for short periods of time. And then most of the time they won't. At least in person. That's kind of how I think it's likely to evolve. And then, as you said, for hybrid is, I don't know, it's a little bit risky. It's sort of, in some ways, it's halfway between the two, but you can very easily end up in a worst of all worlds situation that hopefully firms are going to try hard to avoid, because you have to live in the region, you have to live within commuting distance, you're limited to the local labor population, and you have to commit to establishing processes so that remote workers can do things effectively.
So you might as well be in person. It's kind of with all of that.
Yeah. So anyway, that's the risk. But.
No, I can see that. Actually, I didn't think about the risk burden of hybrid as much. Great. Okay. Last question, which is, what does a productive day or week look for you?
So I am trying to write a new post for New Things Under the Sun about every 7 business days. So it's about 10 days sort of on average. And so I do a mix of reading for that and then writing for that. And then I have other projects. And I think I don't have a hard time staying focused, and because I have 3 kids, and when I drop them off at daycare versus when I pick them up is like the only time to really get things done. And so I work pretty intensely for that middle period. And then I'm too frazzled to do much else outside those areas. So I'm usually reading or writing. I think one thing that's interesting about doing the newsletter is you're synthesizing. I'm trying to synthesize and write about existing work that's, invariably very high quality, because that's why I chose to write about it. And so I didn't really realize this until I was working on my own research project recently and had that feeling of like thinking your things are going really well, and then about 3 hours later realizing that you made an error and like everything was a waste. And so like you have like, I didn't realize, but like, yeah, the safety, or I don't know, the risk is lower of like me. I'm always producing stuff that I think is valuable. I'm doing it more often now rather than doing these like really uncertain things. So I think that's what a productive day looks like for me. Drop the kids off, read or write until 5, answer emails and go to meetings is less productive. It feels less productive, but probably needs to be done anyway. And that's it. Yeah.
And the occasional podcast.
That's right. I love it. Yeah.
Great. Well,
so
with that, thank you very much. I think that was an amazing conversation. And please check the link down below and subscribe to Matt's Substack. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
If you appreciate the show, please like and subscribe, as it helps others find the podcast.